Element students, welcome. I'm excited to be with you this evening. And so we're going to dive right into this book called Esther. Esther is found in the Old Testament. So let's get started. Esther, this is one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. While some of the Jews did not return to Jerusalem, many did not. The book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters are two Jews, Mordecai and his niece Esther. Then there's the king of Persia and the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Esther is a curious book in the Bible because God is never mentioned, not once. Yet his hand is everywhere. Esther chapter 4:14 gives us the heartbeat of the whole book. It says this, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." This may strike you as odd because the Bible is supposed to be about God, right? However, this is a brilliant technique by the anonymous author. It's an invitation to read the story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of odd coincidences and ironic reversals that force you to see God's purpose at work behind every scene. Here's the big idea. The book of Esther asks us to trust in God's direction or hand even when we can't see it working. That requires a posture of hope to trust God's commitment to redeem his good world and overcome evil. Imagine there's a button on stage, and if you press it, you might win. If you press it, you might lose. If you press it, you might be embarrassed. If you press it, you might lose nothing. You don't know what will happen. Faith feels like that. Most of us hesitate because we don't like risk. We like knowing the outcome. We like guarantees. But faith doesn't always come with guarantees. You see, Esther had a moment like that. She was a queen, but her people were about to be destroyed. If she went to the king without permission, she could die. And she said, "If I perish, I perish." That's risky faith. So question, what's something that feels risky to you right now? Trying out for something? Standing up for someone? Speaking truth? Obeying God? Let's dive into Esther chapter 1 and 2, and we'll summarize it real quick. Esther becomes queen. The story begins when the king of Persia throws two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. For the grand purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor, he's thrown a gigantic party. Esther 1:3-4 describes the king's massive feast or party. He gave a feast while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness. On the last day of the feast, the king went crazy, get this, and demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and enraged, the king disposes Vashti and makes a silly decree that all Persian men, get this, should be the master of their own homes. Then the king holds a beauty pageant to find a new queen. And right when the story feels like a bad soap opera, we're introduced and meet Esther and Mordecai. Esther 2:10 says, "Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known." Then in Esther 2:17, it says this, the king loved Esther more than all the women, so that he set the royal crown on her head. But here's the thing, Esther hides her Jewish identity and poses as a Persian, and she wins the pageant. The king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her as the new queen of Persia. You see, Esther didn't claw her way into power. She was placed there. Esther chapter 2:21-23 says, Mordecai heard of a plot and he told Queen Esther, and it was recorded in the book of Chronicles. It was recorded. That small detail will change everything later. Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king, and then he informs Esther, who then tells the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. And in all of these remarkable events, God is not even mentioned, but it seems so coincidental. Seriously, what is God up to? Well, God is setting the stage. So question, have you ever experienced something that felt like a coincidence at first, but later seemed like God's timing? Yeah. Let's dive back into Esther's chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6. And really, it's Haman's plot and Mordecai's rise to power. We begin to find out in the next part of the story. We're introduced to Haman, who's not a Persian, but an Agagite. I think that's how you say it, Agagite, a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom and demands that all people kneel before him. But when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel. Haman is filled with rage. He's mad. When Haman finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, get this, he successfully persuades the king to enact a decree to destroy all the Jews. Get this. They decide the date of this horrific day in an outrageous way. Haman rolls some dice and the decree is set. 11 months later, on the 13th day of Adar, all the Jews will be executed. Crazy. Haman and the king throw a party to celebrate the decree. Even more crazier. After this, the story focuses on Mordecai and Esther, who are now the only hope for the Jewish people. They plan for Esther to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask that he reverses the decree back in chapter 4. But there's a risk involved, because approaching the king without a royal request was an act worthy of death, according to Persian law. At a crucial moment in the story, Mordecai asserts that if Esther remains silent, get this, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Then he wonders aloud, who knows, maybe you've become the queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery and says, if I perish, I perish. And then she decides to approach the king. 2 questions. When have you felt pressure to bow to something that goes against your faith? Question 2. What would it look like for you to say, if I perish, I perish? Meaning, if it costs me, I will obey God. So I have 3 points for you. Point 1 is this. God puts you where you are on purpose. Esther didn't become queen by accident. Her cousin Mordecai told her in Esther 4:14, maybe you are here for such a time as this. Here's the thing. You are not in your school by accident. You're not on your team by accident, not in your friend group by accident. God has placed you where you are for a reason. And maybe it's to stand up for someone being bullied, to invite someone to church, to live differently, to speak truth when everyone else stays quiet. Maybe you feel ordinary. Esther probably did too. But here's the thing. God uses ordinary students for extraordinary purposes. Point 2. Fear is normal. Courage is choosing God anyway. Fear is normal. Courage is choosing God anyway. Let's be real. Esther was scared. Esther 4:11 says, or reminds us, she could die. Esther 4:16 shows us she went away. You see, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's obedience in the presence of fear. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you choose to trust God more than you fear. School pressure is real. I get it. Fear of being left out. fear of looking weird, fear of losing friends, fear of failing. But faith says, I'm scared, but I trust God. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to be faithful. Point 2. Let's go into point 3. You obey, God handles the outcome. Point 3, you obey and God handles the outcome. Here's what Esther did. Esther fasted, she prayed, and then she stepped forward. She didn't control the king. She didn't control the outcome. She controlled her obedience. Like I said, Esther fasted, she went, and God reversed. Esther 8 verse 16 later says, for the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. You see, it went from confusion to joy. That's what God does. Here's the rule. You take care of obedience, God takes care of outcomes. When you tell the truth, when you stand up for someone, when you share your faith, when you make the right choice, you're pressing the faith button. You don't control what happens next, but God does. He promises to be with you. Jesus said in Matthew 28:20, get this, he says this, I am with you always, to the very end of age. Not just when it works out, it's always. There are 2 types of faith stories. 1, there's the boring faith. You stay quiet, you blend in, you avoid risk, and you play it safe. Then there's the adventure faith. You trust God, you step out, you risk obedience, and you watch God move. So, which story do you want to tell someday? I stayed safe, or there were moments I was nervous, but I trusted God, and He showed up. Let me ask you this. What's your such a time as this moment? Is there someone you need to stand up for? Is there a friend you need to invite? Is there a sin you need to walk away from? Is there courage God is asking you to show? Where is God asking you to step forward? You see, Esther, she never saw the full picture, but she obeyed her part, and God wrote the reversal. Sometimes faith might feel risky, but with Jesus, it's never reckless. This week, take one bold step. Press that button and watch your faith go from safe to strong, from quiet to courageous, from bland to an adventure with God. Trust the unseen hand of God and watch Him turn the story.